I thought it might be helpful to go through some of the earlier material we covered this year in the form of a little bit of a webcast here. So I'm going to show you some slides and some images and start with this sort of basic idea of what is the nervous system and then what are some its basic organization and structure. So we'll start right here, and we are going to first of all just remind ourselves that the nervous system has two major divisions. We have what we usually start with is the central nervous system, or the CNS, which we know consists of brain and spinal cord. But we also have the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything else in the nervous system, everything outside of that central brain and spinal cord area, all the other components of the nervous system that are connecting and integrated with the central nervous system. So here's a good image of it so you can kind of see it just to give you an idea. So central is in blue, you can see here the brain, and here you can see the spinal cord. So it looks kind of small in comparison when you look at peripheral, which is all of this out here, but obviously the roles that they play are both very important. So here on the right you can see sort of the removed brain with this spinal cord, and then these parts here at the very end of the spinal cord called the cauda equina. And we mentioned this earlier in this year. It actually means horse's tail. And so these are some of the elements within the spinal cord that are connecting ultimately with the peripheral nerves. Here's another way to look at it, though. So it's not always nice to see these kind of graphics and these charts. So we can see that here's our central nervous system where we have the brain and the spinal cord. And then here's the peripheral nervous system, which includes the autonomic part of the peripheral, which is everything that's sort of regulating what's happening in the body, activating or inhibiting different glands and blood vessels and organs, and very much all a part of our day-to-day regulation and communication between the central and the peripheral nervous system. And under that umbrella, we can look at the sympathetic branch of that, which we know is the one that's going to do what we call arousal or excitation of some part of the body, where the parasympathetic is the opposite. So this is sort of the accelerator and the brake. We can go over here, though, and also look at somatic. And somatic we've only touched upon when we were looking at, I think it was Mia who presented on the neuromuscular junction, although we have had some connections from with this division when we've looked at some other things relative to muscle movement and the activity that could be involved with skeletal movement. So that's somatic. So think like soma is the cell body. This has to do with carrying that information from the central nervous system, or rather to the central nervous system from our sense organs. So this would also have been somewhat under the umbrella, a little bit of the pain information that our bodies transmit, but we'll get into more on this after midterms. So central division, brain and spinal cord, and then we want to take it even further. We want to see how it's organized. So within the central, we can look at two elements of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, which are just the brain's two sides. We can also look at what's called the cortex, which is the more developed part of a brain, the part that we look at as being somewhat wrinkly, and it's that outer layer, the last evolutionarily developed area in higher organisms is the cerebral cortex. And we will mention a little bit about development because I need to remind you that also was a part of our earlier days of discussion. So here we go. So this we can look at some of these terms that we remember looking at. We can, but on this slide, what we're focused on is the gyri, which is the raised areas, and the sulci, which are the little depressed areas on the brain surface. all of those, and why we have so much of this as a human being, and any of the higher mammals have this, is because it increases how much of this cortex which developed, it increases the available surface area and puts a lot of real estate into a much smaller space. So our heads couldn't grow too big, therefore we had to find a way to have our brain sort of get more compacted in a sense. There are some other things on here too, which we're going to talk about in some future slides, but this is a really nice division of these shows division points here. We're looking at a lateral view of the brain. So we'll go back to those. If we just look at the lobes, we know that we have a frontal lobe, which includes everything anterior to this line right here. We have a parietal lobe, so all this in blue. We have the occipital, and then we have the temporal lobe. So the descriptors over here, we know that the occipital is involved with visual processing. It's called the primary visual cortex. The temporal lobe is involved with auditory processing. But that is a little bit too simplistic, because as you have just recently looked at and learned, we know that the occipital lobe is where the primary information goes, but there are other areas that process vision within other parts of the cortex. And so we'll look at those pathways later. And we have this parietal lobe, and then we have, obviously we talked about the frontal lobe, we'll get into more. This view is good. So here we see the interior. This is a sagittal section. It's called mid-sagittal because it's really divided right down the middle, splitting the hemispheres into two hemispheres. Now we're looking at them internally. So this is mid-sagittal. So we'll see some other ways we can talk about how we can divide the brain. But this is a great picture because it's really clear and showing you some of these. Here's the cortex, right? So here's that upper part, the all wrinkled part that we see here in pink and in red and in blue and in purple, some of that being now below the surface. Here's the cingulate gyrus. If you remember, that's a part that has a lot of importance in communicating between some of these interior areas of the brain and the frontal area of the brain. So we'll again get back to that. We know that we can see this white corpus callosum, which is all white matter tracts, meaning that these are all myelinated axons that are passing from one hemisphere to the next. We can see a couple other structures here, which are part of this area that we're going to look at soon, but we've already taken a little bit of a look at already when we've talked about the limbic system. Here is that cavity. See that right below the corpus callosum we have a ventricle, which, remember, there are two lateral ventricles and then a third and a fourth ventricle. And in seeing this, remember that these ventricles are really spaces, and within them are those cells called the choroid plexus, which are involved with making cerebral spinal fluid. Here's the pineal gland. We talked about that in terms of melatonin. Here's these little hill-like structures, superior and inferior. Sorry, this is cut off, but the word is colliculus. They're involved with some secondary visual processing as well for the superior, and secondary auditory processing for the inferior. Here's the cerebellum. And then we have the brain, the midbrain, this area right in here, where actually quite a few of you mentioned some nuclei from some of the neurotransmitters that you were talking about. So there's quite a number of important areas here that produce neurotransmitters. And then this whole section in here, where we're really including the pons then and the medulla and the spinal cord, and we're looking at this as being the brain stem. Here's our pituitary gland. You know that this is the thalamus, therefore the hypothalamus is right below that. And so that's a really nice view. I'd really recommend looking at this again, and I'll talk about it again too. Here's the basal view of the brain. So in other words, we flipped it upside down, and this is where we can see the olfactory bulb, which in us, as we can see right here, and in a sheep, when we were doing dissections, this was quite a bit larger, kind of extended out. We have the optic chiasm. Here's where we can see the pituitary gland from the underside. These little structures here called the mammillary glands, mammillary bodies, right here are part of that hippocampal and limbic system. Here's our pons. Pons means hill or bridge. There's the medulla, and then it just keeps going into the spinal cord. So it's a nice view of this. We can see the different lobes. Notice that these there's still this wrinkly appearance because these are still part of the cortex. We can, again, look at the brain in different orientations. So if we had a brain in front of us, we've already just looked at a sagittal section. That's what we looked at right here. If I can move back to that, there's the sagittal, or in this case, mid-sagittal. But we also can look at the brain from the coronal view. And when we look at the coronal view, we get a different view. We get a different look at some of these structures. Here's the corpus callosum. Now we can see this bridging across these two left and right hemispheres. We can see an area that we very often see only in this, when we're looking at it from the side or lateral view, but here it is again, the basal ganglia involved with movement. Here's the amygdala, so we can see it down here from the lower area. And then very noticeable right here and right here is the lateral ventricle. When we're cutting in this direction, we're doing this coronal piece. And this is really important because this area in here we can really see some changes in people who have schizophrenia. So we'll talk about that. That's coming up in our Candell reading. Now, I'm not sure now, I'm going to do this, see if I can move this while we're here, because I'm sorry about that. I think my little webcam is in the way. But here's a horizontal section. So in other words, we're cutting it as if we're cutting from the forehead back, and it just shows you different structures that we wouldn't see, or at least see structures that are in a different position. So that's the main thing I wanted to show you there. This also shows that, though, so this is kind of nice because you can see, if I can again move this over just a little bit, you can see the way that they're talking about these planes that you would divide if you were going to get what you see below. One more time, but this time we're going to add in those terms that we used for orientation. So things like medial and lateral, things like anterior, which is this side, or rostral, which is toward the nose, posterior or caudal, toward the tail. Proximal is near the center, where distal would be something away from the center. And then dorsal is going to be toward the back. And that in a human being, that's kind of hard to see, because if we looked at this just from if this was a sheep, it'd be much clearer, but remember our heads are kind of oriented differently because we stand on 2 feet. So when we're talking about dorsal and ventral, again, we're always referring to something that's toward the back of whatever we're referring to, or ventral much more toward the belly side of what we're referring to. There's some boundaries. Here's the central sulcus, and that's going to divide the frontal lobe from the parietal. But it also has another function, and that's kind of giving us a landmark to see where the primary motor cortex is and where the primary sensory cortex is. Or we also can call that the precentral gyrus, because it's the part sticking up. Precentral meaning in front of the central sulcus, and here's the postcentral gyrus right behind. And I'm going to have to quit right here, but I'm going to start again with a little bit on, well, actually, I kind of just talked about this, so maybe I could finish this up really quickly. We just talked about these two, and then we've actually really already talked about the corpus callosum, so that's pretty good. And the difference between white matter and gray matter. And I think I'll stop here and continue in just a minute.